happy to have Dr. Sheila Puffer here as our keynote speaker. You have her brief bio in the program, but I just want to add a few more things just to, so you know her background and the research she has done related to the focus of our event today. Sheila received her PhD in Business Administration from University of California, Berkeley. She also has a diploma in management from Plekhanov Institute of the National Economy in Russia. Her MBA was from University of Ottawa, Canada, and her BA was in Slavic Studies from University of Ottawa. So she is a fellow at the Davis Center for Russian Studies at Harvard University. She has served as program director of the Gorbachev Foundation of North America at Northeastern University, where she is a distinguished university professor. She worked for 6 years as an administrator in the government of Canada and has consulted for a number of private and nonprofit organizations. Also, she is a prolific writer, author. She was the editor of the Academy of Management Executive and a member of the Academy's Board of Governors between 1999 and 2002. And she serves on numerous editorial boards, including the Journal of International Business Studies, Journal of World Business, and European Journal of International Management. So it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Puffer here to talk to us about business customs in Eastern Europe, particularly Russia, Ukraine, and Hungary, based on her research. So welcome.
Thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I have learned a great deal already, so it's been a very fulfilling morning for me. And I wanted, before I got started, to introduce my technical specialist here, Sydney Deegan, and she is the daughter of my cousin Allison Deegan, who lives just down the road here, practically on campus. And I thought if nobody else were here for the keynote luncheon, then at least I would have my family here. Also, I think you would agree with me that the lunch is outstanding. What a high quality meal. We're being treated very well today by the university and by Indiana University. But if you could imagine, given the countries I'm focusing on, just imagine that you started with borscht in Russia, then you had a little pirahey from Ukraine, and lastly, what are we going to have, of course, from Hungary? Goulash, that's all I can think of. All right, put lots of paprika on it. All right, I'm going to stand here. I think I can read the slides a little easier from here, and Sydney is going to advance each slide. Please start, Sydney. I'm going to, the reason I chose Russia is that that's been my country of focus for the past 3 decades. I've done a lot of research and writing about pretty much every aspect of business and management in the former Soviet Union. My current book is a complete departure from that. It's coming out in May with Cambridge University Press. I'll get my plug out of the way right at the beginning here. The book is called Hammer and Silicon: The Soviet Diaspora in the U.S. Innovation Economy. Immigration, innovation, institutions, imprinting, and identity. My colleagues and I have 2 co-authors. We interviewed 150 people who immigrated from the countries of the former Soviet Union, half of whom are in Silicon Valley, and the other half, of course, in the Boston-Cambridge Innovation Hub. So we have a 400-page book that is replete with direct quotes by all of these 150 people about their lives in the former Soviet Union, the challenges that they encountered, how they overcame them, their outstanding educational backgrounds in those countries of the former Soviet Union, and then the challenges that they faced adapting to society in the United States as well as the workplace, and how they had to adjust their leadership styles, their teamwork styles, as well as their communication styles. And then we also looked at how they networked, both within the Russian-speaking diaspora in the United States, as well as American business networking organizations. Lastly, we asked them, what's your identity? Who are you? And that's something we all ask ourselves from time to time. How many people in the room are actually immigrants? I am too. I immigrated from Canada. And how many people were born in other countries? Put your hands up too. Definitely born in another country. So immigration, of course, is in the headlines around the world. It's a very important topic, and my co-authors and I hope to contribute to that literature. So that's my forthcoming publication, and the reason why I focused on Russia as one of the countries today. I selected Ukraine because it's really an up-and-coming country within Central and Eastern Europe, very prominent, and it's taking over in some ways from Russia's capability, particularly in IT. Ukraine is very rich in software developers, and it's a very big market as well for all sorts of consumer and commercial goods. Lastly, I decided to focus on Hungary because it's a little bit different from Russia and Ukraine. So we've learned this morning a great deal about business conditions and opportunities in 3 other important Central and Eastern European countries: Serbia, Bulgaria, and Poland. So let's take a look now at the people side of this. I didn't dare think of talking about how to do business and conduct negotiations with a Serb or a Bulgarian. I'll leave that to you to seek out with the experts yourselves. So instead, I thought, let's look at the interpersonal side of doing business in these countries. Next slide, please. First of all, when you want to establish a relationship, it's pretty nice to find some kind of a hook that will be of interest to the other party. All of these countries, the people in these countries are very relationship-oriented. That's a key thing to keep in mind. And they're not just going to make a quick business transaction with you. It's not the way it works. So why not look around the Chicago area and see what these communities look like right here? The Ukrainian diaspora, the Hungarian diaspora, and the Russian diaspora. Lo and behold, Russians started coming here in the 1860s. They've been in the Chicago South Side, and they have set up since the new wave of immigration in the 1990s to the present. As you can see at the bottom, they have even established some Russian language publications right here in the Chicago area. All right, so there's a nice photo of the Holy Trinity Orthodox Cathedral. All right, next one, please. Ukrainians, likewise. They started coming in the 1880s. I don't need to tell you that. There's a very huge, this is, I believe, the largest Ukrainian community in the United States is in the Chicago area. And so we've got St. Nicholas Greek Catholic Church in Chicago's Ukrainian Village neighborhood. All right, and we can see that the Ukrainian village still remains the cultural hub. Next one. Hungarians in Chicago. We've got, you see a religious theme here in my slides. St. Stephen, King of Hungary Church. And you can see that the first Hungarian immigrants came in the 1850s, and they worked in a famous place where they worked was a Hungarian-owned factory called Cinco Tool Company. All right, and there was a factory. The factory is located in Little Hungary. So you get the idea. It's a bit of a hook for talking with people in the home countries in Central and Eastern Europe. You can find a common link here. Next. Now, this is a mess. I'm going to deconstruct this, but what the plan is here for the rest of my talk is to show some of the cultural differences that can have an impact on how effective you are engaging in business transactions with people from Russia, Ukraine, and Hungary. By the way, these data are also available for dozens of other countries. I've used a very effective resource that we also use with our students at Northeastern University and many other universities around the country. It's called Globe Smart. What's great about this is there are 5 very important interpersonal dimensions that are measured across many countries. And so you can make lots of different comparisons, and they're easy to visualize. Well, the thing about this one is that it's based on real people. Thousands of Ukrainians have actually filled out this short survey online. Working people, professionals, similarly for the other countries. So there's a very solid basis in reality for these dimensions. So if we look down the left-hand side, we see the dimension of how independent or individualistic are people versus how interdependent, how much do they want and prefer to work in groups, to consult one another in groups rather than going out front and going it alone, the decision. Secondly, egalitarianism. Again, treating people maybe on an equal plane and not having a steep hierarchical structure in your organization. Risk-taking versus a preference for certainty and safety. Are you a direct communicator or an indirect communicator? Very subtle with body language and a lot unspoken, which makes it a lot tougher to permeate the psyche of people that you're working with if they're indirect communicators. And lastly, are people focused on getting the job done, the task, or taking the time? Maybe you're in the middle of a task, but all of a sudden, some people that you haven't seen for a while come on the scene, and you divert your energy and attention to developing that relationship or renewing that relationship. So we'll just go kind of one by one to see where Ukrainians, Russians, and Hungarians have similar profiles or different profiles, and how important it is not to make assumptions about that one size fits all, even within a country, because there can be, and there most certainly are, regional differences in, for instance, appetite for risk. Here in the United States, right? Silicon Valley, whoa, off the charts in terms of risk-taking. But perhaps in other less internationally oriented states or parts of the country, you might find people being more risk-averse. So regional differences are important. In Ukraine, for instance, Eastern Ukraine is much more Russian-speaking and has much more Russian characteristics. Whereas Western Ukraine borders on what country? Poland. And so guess what? It's much more European and more Polish in its culture, okay? Relatively speaking to the eastern part of Ukraine. All right, so next slide, please. So look at this. The United States is a complete outlier in culture all over the world. A complete outlier. And we're such a big market here, we're such a big country that we don't recognize necessarily how different we are, all right? And so it's us, we're the ones who have to adapt when we go around the world and learn to appreciate a different mindset and different ways of interacting with people. So Americans, fiercely independent, no kidding, right? And we prefer pretty flat hierarchies in organizations. We tend to call people by their first name pretty quickly. There are regional differences within the United States with regard to that, of course. We're very much risk takers, right? And in the United States, even the laws and the infrastructure supports risk taking. Bankruptcy laws, you're not ruined for life. You can rise from the ashes and start again. Learn from your failures. Other countries, bankruptcy, if you're bankrupt, you're done. You're toast. Pretty much, right? The laws just don't serve you as well. All right, we're pretty darn direct. We speak quite openly. We don't beat around the bush too much. And then lastly, yeah, we have to slow ourselves down, if you're like me, and be patient, because we just want to get the job done. Forget about all the small talk, right? So it's exceedingly important for us to make a conscious effort to slow down and show a genuine interest in the people we are trying to develop a business relationship with. Next. All right, next, please. Look at Russia. Okay, here, I think the biggest thing I'd like to point out is Russians are overall very direct in their communication. In the interviews with these high-tech people here in the United States who emigrated from the former Soviet Union, this is one of the biggest issues that they found in adjusting to the American tech workplace, because they would say, well, this is all wrong, and you're totally wrong, and here's why. And, you know, discussion closed. And they say, разговор окончен, conversation over, right? And I don't know about you, but I don't take to that very well, all right? And so this is quite an adjustment for people coming from that part of the world to fitting into the workplace here, all right? On the other hand, you can see where Russians fit on the other dimensions. Let's go to the next one. Ukraine. Look at, they're not so direct in their communication. A little more genteel, a little more subtle, all right? But, and yet, Ukrainians are more indirect than Americans. So you might want to be sensitive when dealing with Ukrainians to make sure you're reading them correctly, right? And that you're giving them enough time to give you cues and signals in a way that they feel comfortable with, rather than they won't be blurting out, you're all wrong, and here's why, all right? All right, let's move to the next one, which is Hungary, and it's kind of a similar profile to Ukraine. All right, so kind of middle of the road for the most part. But again, all of these three countries are very much on the relationship orientation side versus task. So again, a very common similarity among the three countries. Next, please. All right, so look at this communication style. It's just a bit of a summary. And we talked about in Russia and Ukraine, they're fairly direct. In contrast, Hungary is a little more indirect. And then what is high versus low context? A high context culture means that a lot is left unsaid. One of the highest context cultures is Japan. Enigma. You know, there are people who, well, I know Becky says she and her husband have lived in Bulgaria for 18 years. They've probably got that all figured out. However, if you had been living for 18 years in Japan, you'd still be wondering, what are they really trying to say to me here? High context culture. Okay, so all three countries have are not quite as easy to figure out as Americans. Okay? Expressive versus reserved. Hungarians tend to be a little more reserved. I don't know about you, but you know, remember Dr. Zhivago, the movie? Everybody's crying in that movie like crazy. And Russians are very emotional people. And they yell. They yell at work. And it's not that they're really that angry, it's just their way of communicating. Hungarians aren't going to do that. All right. And a formal communication style. One needs to be mindful of protocol in European countries, right? And so it's not you walking in, hi y'all, how you doing, right? It's just being very respectful of everyone in the room and being reserved. And you need to be taken seriously. Don't smile too much. They think that's fake, and they think that you're kind of stupid. Yeah, you're not serious, you're not intelligent. So when I speak in Europe, and in Russia particularly, I'm a different presenter altogether. Right? Here's a little bit more detail. Maybe I'll just say, not only are there regional differences in these big countries, but there can be urban versus rural or smaller towns, right? And in Ukraine, older generations tend to be a little more reserved. They were brought up in a different educational system from the current generation, okay? And in Hungary, we also have Budapest, the capital, being a little less formal than in other parts of the country. It's a little more international. Next, please. So direct versus indirect communication. And I think this is a real key in terms of trying to have a good relationship with people and appreciate where they're coming from. So Russians and Ukrainians tend to be more direct in speech. They're not afraid to speak their mind or be straightforward. All right, and this is an interesting thing about the word "niet." Everybody knows the word "niet." We all know what 3 or 4 words of Russian, right? And that's number one. And the thing is that although it means no, it may just be kind of a knee-jerk reaction initially. Just like in Japan, the knee-jerk reaction is yes, which doesn't mean anything either. So just dismiss that and carry on. Okay, and Hungarians tend to be a little more indirect, and they're not going to open up and be candid until they've developed a personal relationship with you. Yes, next. Oh, personal space. Those of you who have traveled around the world might recall a little bit of discomfort in terms of your physical space. I lived in Moscow for a year back during the Moscow Olympics, just prior to the Moscow Olympics in 1980. It was the height of the Cold War, and it was also getting to be the height of huge shortages and a lot of discontent and stagnation of the economy. And I had to stand in line, long lines, like everybody else, to buy my carrots and to buy my theater passes. And coming from the big, wide open spaces of Canada, where there are, 2 people for every 3,000 square miles, I was very uncomfortable standing in those lines. And people would keep pushing me ahead, and I would kind of stand my ground and leave the space that I wanted. People didn't like that, all right? So we just have to get used to it. And Hungarians usually prefer an arm's length distance in conversation. That's way out there, depending on the length of your arm. And I think that may be even a little bit more distant than Americans. Try it out. Next, please. Well, what are the business protocols in these countries? Just as in Japan, the ritual of the business card is sacred, isn't it? Right? So what's it all about in these 3 countries? Well, for one thing, greetings on the right, people do shake hands. And women typically initiate the handshaking with a man in those countries. And it's very appropriate. And in Ukraine, yeah, they say men generally greet women using eye contact and a verbal greeting rather than shaking hands. But if you're a business negotiator from abroad and you're a woman, I recommend in those countries that you do shake hands, that you initiate that. It shows your professionalism. Punctuality. Hungarians, pretty punctual, whereas Russians and Ukrainians might not be right on time, but they would expect you to be and wait around. This is not Mexico, though. All right, I was a trade representative for a brief time for a Canadian trading company, and I showed up at these Russian or Soviet ministries at the time to check up on various orders that were in process, and I made sure that I showed up early, and I knew where I was going. And there are a lot of hoops to go through in terms of security and just protocol, people to meet you and vet you. So good to be there on time. Next. So what about how to dress? Well, in Russia, Ukraine, and Hungary, they say business attire is generally quite conservative. However, if any of you have gone to Moscow and seen the high fashion women in business, it's quite a sight to see, really. And they walk around the streets of Moscow with their spike heels like this high, and they're not conservative dressers, I have to say. But as a woman doing business and representing your company and your country, I highly recommend a conservative look. And there is a little bit of business casual that has permeated parts of Eastern Europe, right? But people tend to be much more fashion conscious, that your shoes are shined and you look serious when you are about to do business. Now, body language. I told you about the smiling, right? Which a lot of people have the mistaken stereotype that Russians are not happy people. Right? And all you got to do is read Dostoevsky. You know they're not happy, right? Huh? And suffering is what life is all about, right? However, they are some of the funniest people. They laugh the loudest that you can ever imagine. But that's when they know you. And I recommend getting to know these people on a personal basis. All right. And you can see, any kind of hand gesture. Just try to avoid in any country, right? We know that there are the perils of different meanings of various hand gestures. Next, please. All right, what about business protocol? On the right-hand side, you've probably heard of the patronymic that is used in a lot of Slavic countries. What about Eastern? What about the former Yugoslavia? Do people use a patronymic in some of those countries or not? You're not sure? They do? They do? I thought so, yeah. So a patronymic is your father's name. And a lot of Russians had told me they wish that this would just be done away with, because it's tough enough in business remembering the first and last name of somebody, but when you got to remember the father's name and stick it in between, it gets to be onerous, right? All right. So, but that is the safest way to address someone. As you know, I was the program director for the Gorbachev Foundation of North America, and guess who came to town numerous times and I got to meet? Yes, this is the highlight of my professional career. You can imagine, right? Other than today, right? But the point was that what the heck do you call President Gorbachev? You don't call him President Gorbachev. You say, Доброе утро, good morning. What do you say? Mikhail Sergeyevich, Michael Sergey, right? And that's no matter whether it's Gorbachev, the leader of, the former Soviet Union, or whether it is the custodian. That's the way to address people in Russia. It's pretty cool. You never go wrong by calling the person by their first name and their patronymic. All right. And Hungarians will introduce themselves with their surname first, which can be tricky, because I don't know about you, but Hungarian names look pretty tough to me. I wouldn't know the first name from the last name, I don't think. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. By the way, they tend to do that in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia as well. And in school, for instance, the roll call will be last name first. Okay. And interestingly, though, we are advised to introduce ourselves using our first name first. Okay. So let's not mess it up. Okay. And over here, business cards are actually quite formally introduced at the beginning of a business meeting. So please ensure that you have a good supply with you. And it's awfully nice if you've got, on the flip side, all of your information in that language, in that country's language. They appreciate it very much. They're a pretty basic thing to say, but sometimes we forget those details. And this is something I didn't know, that traditionally, Hungarian women will list their husband's name and their husband's title above their own maiden name. I'm not so sure whether that's still the case, But if it, yeah, that seems kind of old-fashioned to me. But so this is pretty recent information. But some take with a grain of salt, I would say. Next, please. All right. Well, what about attitude towards foreigners? Are we going to be welcomed? Are we going to be put under suspicion? Are we going to be trusted? We're going to be suspect. But generally, there are positive views of foreigners. We do have to be more and more careful, of course, in today's political climate about our Americanism, and we need to be very subdued about it. It's just a wise thing, and to avoid raising issues in the political arena that don't have a bearing directly on your business. Just best to stay away from all of that. But an important thing is when you perhaps are setting up your operations in these countries, it's important to really show respect for the locals. Rather than coming in, swooping in, having all the answers, or trying to impose American management methods. A lot of dialogue needs to go on, and to understand how the management structure works in these countries, and to show great respect for the top person and figure out quickly who that is. One of the issues is that in these countries, decisions are made at the top, even minute decisions, almost like ordering the toner for the printer. Oh, that decision is made far too high up in the hierarchy, right? And so it's very important to show great deference to the top person. And in these countries, if you're not the top person in your organization, you may not be taken seriously. So you really need to establish your credibility and the decision-making powers that are invested in you in order to gain the trust of the top people there. Next. Okay, and attitudes toward business. Well, one of the, of course, obvious things about the communist system was the denigration of capitalism. And this has left, because of the heavy indoctrination about the evils of capitalism and the exploitation of the workers and the profit, the negative connotation of profit being taking advantage of people. All of that still has an imprint among many people, particularly of older generations, but it's still there among new generations as well, which demonstrates a conservatism and a bit of a reticence sometimes to engage in a deal that's not totally certain. So it's important to establish, again, your credibility and integrity, and that you are an upstanding business person who is not going to engage in corrupt practices. You're not going to take advantage of people or try to do something underhanded. So let's see what we have. Just looking at Ukraine here, when Ukraine was released from the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, along with the 14 other Soviet republics, it was kind of in free fall, as all of the republics were. And because there was so much hardship, people lost their jobs, they weren't paid, people's jobs evaporated overnight. This led to a lot of unease and a flight toward certainty. And it's important to keep that history in mind. It's only, 25 years ago that their societies changed 180 degrees. And we need to respect the conservatism that is inherent in the mindset of many of these people. Okay. Culture and customs, women in business. We could just take a look at the numbers at Russia, Ukraine, and Hungary and see that in terms of gender roles, women in the former Soviet Union and most of Eastern Europe were encouraged, not only encouraged, but basically required to work. And so a larger percentage of women in these countries have engineering, technical, math degrees, sciences. They're really steeped in the STEM sciences. And that's important to keep in mind. And if you're dealing with women there in business, they may have outstanding credentials, both educationally and work experience, in fields that we may see as more traditionally occupied by men here. Next. What about ethics? Well, see, this is the tough part. We didn't talk about this at all this morning. Maybe we will this afternoon. The Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index doesn't show very favorable numbers for Russia, Ukraine, or Hungary, particularly Russia. I mean, Russia has improved a little bit. It was there with Nigeria, down at the very bottom a few years ago. But Putin has cracked down on petty corruption. He doesn't go after his loyal supporters at the top. That's off limits, right? And he's got his election coming up on March 18th, so we're not going to see any change there, right? But this is the toughest thing that to deal with in these countries. They are vast markets for just about anything we produce, including services. And yet, finding the right partner, as our speakers this morning said, is absolutely key to vet them and to ensure that, one, they're not going to take advantage of you, and two, that you don't get embroiled in bribery, even through intermediary parties that could get you in trouble with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act here in the United States. Next. Well, attitudes towards risk. Business is a risky business. And we can see, as I said, that all three groups are generally more certainty-oriented. They gravitate towards security. And as I mentioned, decision-making power, particularly in Russia, is concentrated at the top. And it can be very slow. Decision-making can be slow. Again, patience with a capital P in doing business. Next, please. Government influence. Well, yes. Government has a very, very heavy influence in these countries. But you can see in Hungary, the policies are generally business-friendly there. And in fact, I think maybe in another slide, I show that the ease of doing business in Hungary is actually very good. So that's encouraging. Unfortunately, the political leanings of the current Hungarian government are becoming quite conservative. With regard to Ukraine, there is the top business people are in bed with the government, and many fulfill dual roles, running huge oligopolies as well as being major government ministers. Not a good thing. And a similar thing happens, of course, in Russia. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Next. What about customer and supplier relations? Well, this is, of course, key. What's the value of a contract? And in Russia, enforcement is generally quite lax. And it's important to establish a personal, trusting relationship rather than rely on every word of a contract. And difficulty of enforcement in Ukraine as well. And there is the nice thing, the bright spot is Hungary here, which, as I mentioned before, well, this one actually shows it in the top 10 in terms of contract enforcement. So that is an encouraging statistic. Go ahead. And gift giving and entertaining. Much more gift giving going on and entertaining in these countries. It's expected, but you still have to be careful. People, this is still true. Going to the banya or the sauna is a very popular thing to do in Russia. Even women in business. I talked with a woman out in Silicon Valley she's originally from Russia, and she's a woman in her 50s now. She's been in Silicon Valley for over 25 years as a tech person. And when she went over to do business for her company, her American company, she went to the banya. Yeah. So don't be shy. You know what I mean? Don't be surprised. Next. I think this is just with regard to negotiations. Very important. Russians particularly see it's all about I win, you lose. No compromise. So it takes a long time, if you're not on the same page, to come to a solution with a Russian negotiator. And it's important to give them an opportunity to save face, particularly in front of their team. Okay? They can yell at you and say, you're wrong, and so on, but don't do that to them in front of their colleagues. That'll just kill it all. All right, and lastly, I think I have another slide. Oh, I think we'll just move along, and we'll move along. And establishing credibility, it's all about the trust. And how do you do that, right? Well, you want to get involved in trusted, tried and true networks, people who have gone before you, right? And utilize the US government and US states networking facilities and the opportunities that are available. And really describing your goals and objectives clearly. Be transparent. It can go a long way. And be consistent in your message can go a long way to building trust. And next. People tend to hoard information, be quite secretive in these countries. And again, by establishing the personal side to the relationship, you can get people to open up and tell you some of the secrets and so on, okay? So-called secrets. Next. There we are. Anyone care to pronounce these for us? Spasiba, Дякую, and Kosinam. And I'd also like to give special thanks to Ryan Donahue, who is our amazing research assistant, and he prepared this slide deck for me. So thank you very much, everyone. And if there are a couple questions, well, no, we were supposed to give you a chance to stand up and move around before the next session begins. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to meet with you today. And thank you to Sydney.